I think it's safe to say this is one of the most extraordinary cases and most extraordinary stories that I've ever been involved in more than 30 years as a journalist.
I said, I report of my son missing. He hasn't been back from school.
6-year-old Rikki was found strangled near his home.
The fact that it took more than 27 years to bring a child murderer to justice is in this country an extremely rare thing. In 1994, I was reporting on the case of the disappearance of a 6-year-old boy with a cheeky smile who went out to play and never came home. Here's the story. I was working as a journalist here in Cambridgeshire when Rikki disappeared. Sometimes huge stories start in a very small way, and this was one of them. It started with a fax coming through to newsrooms. That's right, a fax, not an email. Those were still some way in the future, and it would simply have said that a little boy had disappeared in Peterborough and that appeals were being made for information as to where he might be. His mother, Ruth, reported him missing at about 6 o'clock in the evening on the 28th of November.
I report of my son missing. He hasn't been back from school.
It was late November, it was bitterly cold, the weather was absolutely horrible. But there was no long manhunt for Rikki Neave. He was found in an area of woodland only about 500 metres away from his mum's house on the Welland estate. The way that he was discovered made it apparent to the police immediately that what they were dealing with was no accident, no misadventure, but a murder. Rikki was found naked. His clothes were subsequently found in a wheelie bin very close by, and that his body had been laid out in a kind of star shape, something that had images almost of the occult to it. And at that point, I think people started to realise that they were dealing with something very, very strange indeed. We had learned from talking to neighbours that Rikki came from a chaotic background. Rikki and his sisters were all on the at-risk register. We had allegations that his mother used him to go and collect drugs for her. One suspects that is what first made the police look towards Ruth Neave as a possible suspect. We understand now that the police, wrongly as it turned out, focused their inquiry almost entirely on Ruth Neave and became convinced from a relatively early stage that she was responsible for her son's murder. Less than 2 months after his death, she was arrested initially on charges of child cruelty towards her children, and then subsequently later, a few months later, with murder. She was tried at Northampton Crown Court in 1996. She was acquitted unanimously of Rikki's murder, but she in fact admitted very serious child cruelty charges against Rikki and his sisters, and she served 7 years in prison for what she had done. This question mark, what did happen to that little boy who went out to play and never came home? Most of us did start to think that we would never know who murdered Rikki Neave. I would have to say that after 30 plus years as a journalist, that was the most tense press conference I've ever attended. Ruth reiterated her own innocence, and she called on the police to reopen the investigation and to find out who had murdered her son. Well, the strange thing is that in 1997, ITV Anglia ran a piece involving James Watson that had absolutely nothing to do with Rikki's murder. He was living in a flat in Peterborough with his father, and there was an arson attack, and he had been responsible for putting the flames out. And we ran a very short item on this teenage boy, 15, 16 by then, and at that time, none of us thought anything more about it. They discovered that there had been an eyewitness report at the time of Rikki's death. Watson was spoken to by the police and confirmed that yes, he and Rikki had hung out for a very short period of time. James Watson was only 13 at the time, and that he had then left him and that Rikki had been absolutely fine at that point. Watson's statement, the eyewitness statement, they were simply filed away with all the other evidence, but they sat there for all those years, and that led to James Watson being spoken to a second time by the police. The poignant things about looking at the pictures of little Rikki Neave's clothing is that there it is, his little school uniform that he was wearing that was found kind of callously dumped in a wheelie bin. As it did its job, it was filed away, and it sat there for all those years, samples taken from it, just waiting for somebody to look at them again. And eventually the police did look at them again, and James Watson's DNA was found on them. When he was asked about this in an interview, Watson suddenly remembered that he had picked Rikki Neave up.
Just chucked him over the, over the fence.
Yeah.
Not chucked him over the fence, but held him up over the fence.
Reports of strange behaviour on his part came in from a lot of eyewitnesses, but it really was that DNA evidence. That was the key to it. He had been arrested by police and had been released on bail pending further inquiries into Rikki's murder, when despite the fact that he had no passport, he hid in the back of a friend's camper van and ended up in Portugal. And suddenly, somebody's been arrested in connection with the murder of Rikki Neave, and it seemed extraordinary. It opened up the whole case again and the whole possibility that finally, after so many years, we, and more importantly the family, might actually find out what had happened to Rikki.
A man has been convicted of murdering 6-year-old Rikki Neave more than 27 years ago. His killer, James Watson, who was 13 at the time, almost escaped justice. But a cold case review in 2015 finally linked him to the crime.
James Watson got away with this murder for more than a quarter of a century. I just felt my word. You know, that actually in a sense that is British justice for you. All these years later, the police force still cared enough to find out who killed that little boy. His death tore his family apart. I just hope it does bring some kind of peace, some kind of closure.